Welcome back to another explainer. We spend a lot of time taking complex realities and breaking them down into clear visual pieces. And today we're actually traveling back in time. I want you to just imagine an era where the value of your money wasn't a matter of intense political debate, right? It wasn't decided behind closed doors by central bank committees or, influenced by daily news cycles. Instead, the value of a nation's wealth was anchored to a glittering physical reality. We're looking at a time when money was literally as good as gold. It's such a fascinating question to really kick us off here. Before the era of central banks managing our economies, what actually gave money its value? Today we're just so used to institutional discretion. We have a group of experts pulling levers to manage the whole economy. But for a massive portion of modern history, value relied entirely on physical metal. The money in your pocket had real weight, both literally and economically. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our itinerary for today's journey. We'll start with anchoring money to metal, then look at the automatic adjustment mechanism, the first globalization era, the cost of rigid tracks, and finally, the fall to fiat. So, Section 1. Anchoring money to metal, a fixed quantity. To really understand how we got here, we have to look back to the United Kingdom, specifically 1821. The British pound was defined as a fixed, unchangeable quantity of gold. And the promise here was incredibly simple, but honestly, completely revolutionary. Any paper banknote could be converted directly into actual physical gold, right there on demand at the bank. This became known as the gold standard. It was a strict, rule-based framework tying national currencies to a fixed quantity of gold. And what this meant was that money was no longer just some tool for domestic politicians to play around with. It created a globally interconnected system of predictability that had simply never existed before. Think about it. If you knew the gold weight of a British pound and the gold weight of another currency, well, the exchange rate was practically set in stone. Moving on to Section 2, the automatic adjustment mechanism, how the machine worked. Now, what's really interesting about this is how this massive global system actually regulated itself without modern institutions stepping in. It functioned like a giant, self-correcting machine. Let's just walk through it. Say a country starts buying way too much. They import more than they export. Because they owe money to other nations, actual physical gold has to literally flow out of the country to settle those debts. Now, because the domestic money supply is tied directly to the amount of gold sitting in the vault, less gold means less money circulating in the economy. And with less money going around, domestic prices naturally drop. When your country's goods become cheaper, suddenly other nations want to buy them again, which brilliantly restores the trade balance. It was a rigid but absolutely perfectly self-balancing loop. Which brings us to Section 3, the first globalization era, the golden age of trade. Because of all this incredible predictability, the world entered an era of massive, unprecedented growth. They were effectively sharing a single universal measuring scale for value. This specific window, from 1870 to 1914, is known as the classical gold standard. And while the UK started it, the system really reached its peak when other major economic heavyweights joined in. Germany adopted a similar system in the 1870s, and the United States officially followed in 1900. With all the world's major powers playing by the exact same metallic rules, the stage was basically set for a massive economic explosion. The engines of this golden age were just so powerful. This shared framework gave nations unprecedented confidence to trade with each other. If you were an investor back then, you could move your capital across international borders without that terrifying fear that sudden currency fluctuations would just completely wipe out your wealth. At the same time, you had massive technological leaps like steamships and railways that were physically accelerating trade. And right at the center of this huge web was London. It emerged as the undisputed global financial hub, with the Bank of England acting as the ultimate manager of international gold convertibility. All right, Section 4, the cost of rigid tracks, when the train can't swerve. But of course, no system is totally perfect, right? The very rules that made the gold standard so stable eventually became its absolute biggest threat. So the crucial point is this unyielding rigidity in the face of human crisis. It's basically a balancing act. On one hand, you had these profound advantages, long-term price stability and fiscal discipline. Governments just couldn't print money wildly. If they did, citizens would simply convert their paper back to metal, totally draining the national reserves. But weighed against that protection was a really heavy cost. To protect those precious gold reserves, domestic economies often had to endure agonizing periods of deflation, high unemployment, and severe austerity. Governments were actually forced to slash public spending and reduce wages just to stop gold from flowing out of the country. the social and political costs of this were pretty devastating. Let's do a quick why this matters check-in right here. Think about what happens today when our economy crashes. Central banks step in, right? They lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, or they use quantitative easing to pump money into the system to stimulate growth. Under the gold standard, those tools were strictly forbidden. Because the money supply was completely shackled to physical gold, a government could not easily expand the currency during an economic downturn to help its citizens. Their hands were completely tied. And that leads us to Section 5, the fall to fiat, derailing the gold standard. It was precisely this rigidity that eventually brought the whole system crashing down. And this brilliantly illustrates the simple truth. The rapid evolution and chaotic crises of the 20th century simply outgrew this totally inflexible structure. The first massive fracture happened in 1914 with World War I. Nations desperately needed to print money to finance the war, so they just suspended gold convertibility. They tried to fix it in the 1920s, but global trade balances had already shifted way too much. Then came the absolute death blow, the Great Depression. Faced with a catastrophic collapse in demand and widespread banking crises, the UK officially abandoned the standard in 1931. The US followed in 1933, basically just so they could regain the flexibility to actually manage their suffering economies. After World War II, a modified version called Bretton Woods pegged the US dollar to gold and other currencies to the dollar. But the final nail in the coffin came in 1971. That was the Nixon shock, when President Richard Nixon totally suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold once and for all. Honestly, think of the gold standard exactly like a railway system. It was incredibly stable, highly predictable, and super efficient at moving wealth around the world. But trains are limited to fixed tracks. When a massive macroeconomic roadblock appears on the tracks, like, say, a world war or a Great Depression, a train cannot swerve. It can only crash. So we finally arrived at the profound transition that really defines our modern world. We moved from the past, a system reliant on the absolute certainty of physical metal, to our present reality, which is entirely based on fiat currency. Fiat systems rely fundamentally on the credibility of institutions. Actually, your money has value today simply because you trust the government and the central bank issuing it. It's all about trust. Which leaves us with this provocative thought to close out today's explainer. We essentially traded the rigid safety of a gilded anchor for the flexibility of modern monetary policy. But as we look at a world that relies entirely on institutional trust, we really have to ask ourselves, just how fragile is our modern financial system? It's a massive question, and it naturally leads us into our next part on the rise of global financial powers. So thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll see you in the next explainer.